If anybody had any thoughts that the U.S. troops in Syria, now numbering about 2,000, should be withdrawn, think again. And in fact, on the way out the door, current U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is trying to tell everybody who will listen that they need to stay there. In an interview that just given earlier today, Secretary Austin was trying to explain why and gave these certain reasons here, which this article discusses here, that the U.S. needs to keep its troops deployed in Syria to prevent the Islamic State from reconstituting as a major threat following the ouster of Bashar al-Assad's government. He said American forces are still needed there, particularly to ensure the security of detention camps holding tens of thousands of former ISIS fighters and family member, Austin told people Wednesday in his final interview before he leaves office. So listen, let's just kind of give you a little bit of understanding of what it is, because too often, especially in the United States, people don't have much historical memory. They don't remember things in context, and just taking him at his word and just looking at what Austin said, people may think, oh, okay, well, if there's a major threat, then yeah, sure, it makes sense to keep them there. Okay, first of all, these troops first went into Syria, U.S. troops did, in 2015 when President Obama sent them. And the whole reason why that was happening is because this Islamic State was basically the rebranded and remorphed al-Qaeda in Iraq, that was part of the insurgency that we had been fighting during the famous surge of 2006, 2007 that David Petraeus led. And famously, we vanquished all the enemies. Well, actually, we didn't. We killed the leader, Mossab al-Zarqawi. You may recall that if you were tracking much back then. Big famous because he was one of the most wicked, bloodthirsty, genuinely bloodthirsty leaders that there's been in any of these violent groups. Did all kinds of heinous, barbaric actions. We killed him. Yay, game over. Well, not so much. Like so many times happens here, the group kind of went to ground for a while. They reformed. They got a new leader. They ended up rising back up in al-Baghdadi, you may recall. And then they started spreading. And then because of a lot of the lawlessness that was going on, because the Iraqi security forces did a terrible job of defending their country, and there were still a whole bunch of abuses, especially from the Shia, that was the government then of Maliki initially, and that they were abusing the Sunnis, which was the reason for the whole insurgency that rose up following our illegal war in 2003, allegedly on the weapons of mass destruction claim, etc. That was the big issue, was the Sunni versus Shia split and all that fighting that took place and all that. So we apparently got that under control. Then we left. But then as soon as we left, then Maliki says, yeah, about those agreements I had with the Sunnis, not so much now, because I'm going to play the politics. Which underscores why it's such a fool's errand to think that the U.S. is going to come in from the outside and establish order anywhere, tell people how they ought to live, and to have some idea of how to do it. As long as you're sitting there on the ground, you have some influence. But as we showed from this whole time, from 2003 up to 2011, when we initially withdrew, that's all a minimal kind of stuff anyway. Ultimately, the people on the ground have to figure this out. The ones who are going to live there forever, they're people who have been there for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and are going to be there well into the future, as long as there is a future, they have to figure it out. You can't do it for them. No, not many people in the United States have been willing to acknowledge that lesson. It has been painfully shown so many times, and certainly this issue with first al-Qaeda in Iraq and then to ISIS is one of the more painful evidences of it, because as you know, al-Baghdadi is the one that took over ISIS, and then they started rising up first in Syria. They started taking over some of the area there, exploiting the civil war that was going on there, but then they also moved into the south because of the rot in the Iraqi security forces that we had allegedly trained, and all of our generals told everybody who would listen how good the Iraqi security forces were going on, except the very first time they were tested by literally what was supposed to have been a raid. There was a raid in the city of Mosul of around 1,000 ISIS fighters. They were supposed to have come into the city because there was a whole Iraqi division in the area. I think there was actually parts of 2 divisions. And they were supposed to do a raid, and then before they got caught, they were supposed to leave. But the problem is that the leadership of the Iraqi security forces panicked and said, oh, they abandoned their troops and left and flew to Baghdad. And as soon as the leaders, the fighters saw that the leaders were gone, they also left. Now all of a sudden you have this, what was this supposed to be a raid, all of a sudden turned into a rout. And because there was already so much animosity between the Sunnis and the Shia inside Mosul, as soon as many of the other Sunnis saw the troops come in and the success of ISIS, they supported them. And now all of a sudden you have a much bigger uprising. And then the net result is that you have the so-called capital in Syria, a place called Raqqa. And then they have the whole city there of Mosul, and success breeds success, and all of a sudden you just had a complete rout of the Iraqi security forces, and they got within 50 miles of Baghdad before that ran out its steam. But then you had this big, so-called caliphate. Well, it was always a dead man walking. They never had the capacity because it was a moment of basically a target of opportunity that they had this. But you can't run a semi-state in the middle of two other states and think it has any possibility to survive as a state, because you have to have sustenance. You have to have an economy. You have to have an income. You have to have fuel. You have to have all these things. Nobody was going to give them any of that stuff. So it was always going to be a dead man walking. It was never going to survive because the governments in Baghdad and in Damascus had every incentive to get rid of it. But instead of letting them handle their problems, we said, no. Obama was the original sin here. Instead of just saying, hey, figure it out, Baghdad. You guys are on your own. This is what we trained y'all for. It's a tough neighborhood. Figure it out. Tough love, if you wanted to call it that. But instead, no. Obama gave into political pressure, and certainly there was all kinds of people who never wanted to leave in the first place, because once we go into some place, it is like pulling teeth with no anesthesia to get our troops out of there. Nobody wants to do it, but Obama at least had some political courage and backbone to get them out in 2011, but then that evaporated the first time he was faced, and the troops went back in. And so now then he sent the troops in, first of all, in small number and increments of a few hundred at a time. And then it ended up being, I think it got up to 5,000 at one point. But now then we said, all right, now then we're going to put all these troops there. And we're going to, when Trump came into office, he said, all right, y'all are not just going to be advisors. We're going to actually be part of an offensive operation to get rid of the ISIS and take their territorial holdings back. He worked with the Syrian Democratic Forces in the Syrian area, and he worked with that's the Kurdish primarily group. And then he worked with the Iraqi security forces in Iraq, and then eventually methodically defeated them both, because like I said, it was always going to happen. But here's one of the things that I argued at the time. Why should the United States spend all of our troops and the casualties that we ended up over the whole course of this thing that suffered, and the people that were wounded? And there's probably in a low hundreds of them all together, of people that were wounded at various times. And certainly the money that we spent, the diversion away from defending our own country, about training and preparing for war that we may fight against a near peer at any point. Instead, we for the Syrian Democratic Forces, which, by the way, were a quasi-state itself. That wasn't even an actual organization other than a group inside the country of Syria. And why did we choose to help them and set this up? Where was that ever agreed to? We just did it. And now then there's this idea that, well, because we started it, we should do it forever. And so that's why when I think it was March of 2019, when the last of the ISIS territorial holdings had been taken from them, then Trump declared victory, said, we're going to pull our troops out. I cheered that on at the time. I went on Fox News and I said, yes, that's a great idea. It's exactly what we should do. We should have been there in the first place, but at least Trump gave them a military attainable objective, help these two military forces deprive the terrorist group of ISIS from their territorial holdings. Mission accomplished. Cool, come home. But instead, the foreign policy blob, the so-called foreign policy elite in this country who love war, who lust for it, we're going crazy because they thought, well, we can't leave. And then they came up with every other kind of excuse in the world to keep staying there. And they succeeded. So 3 times in Trump's presidency, he said the troops were going to leave Syria. 3 times he was overridden. And the pressure was too much for him to get over. And they would always come up with some kind of what seemed to be a plausible reason. And he gave into it. So he left office with the troops still there. And of course, Biden has no interest in getting rid of anything. He's cool with just letting people stay everywhere, with the notable exception of Afghanistan, which he had run on wanting to get rid of. So he kept that one campaign promise at the first part of his presidency, but never had any interest in even looking at the stuff in Syria. So now then, here we have the situation where Trump's coming back in, and people are starting to look and say, hey, what are we doing here? Why are we even in? And in fact, even let me give you a bit of a running start here. Here is John Kirby back in 2023, when there was at the time an attack upon some American troops there. And that's, again, people start asking, wait, why do we still have troops in Syria when the ISIS lost its territory long ago? Here's what Kirby said then.
We're not looking to escalate, but we absolutely have a viable mission in Iraq and Syria to go after ISIS, which is still a viable threat. And we got to make sure that we have the troops and the capabilities to do that, which means they need to know that we're going to do what we have to do to protect them. I would note that the flurry of attacks that occurred just in the wake of the strikes we took over the weekend were ineffective, no injuries, no significant damage, and most of them were intercepted.
Okay, that was dumb at the time that it was said, because this, he's doing this whole flurry of activity like it's nothing. Don't worry about it. Why would you want to keep American troops there, the subject of these attacks anyway, wondering when any of them are finally going to get through and when somebody's going to finally get hurt, which they subsequently did. So 3 of them were killed, the ones that were just across the Syrian border in Jordan. But there were scores that were wounded in other attacks, a lot of drone attacks, rocket attacks, mortar attacks. I think there was even some IEDs that were tossed in there, et cetera, for nothing. And then he said this, and this is something that I think, depending on which clips we have, I can't recall, you're going to hear something very close to being a verbatim comment that we still have this enduring defeat ISIS mission, and we can't leave it, as he said there, because it's a very vital mission, very important. And that's the only reason we're there. That's what he had said elsewhere. I don't remember if we had it in that clip or not, but that's something we heard as well. And then here from just this past December, you had Pat Ryder, who said, by the way, I know we've been reporting really for many years that there were 900 Americans in Syria. As it turns out, kind of double that.
As you know, we have been briefing you regularly that there are approximately 900 U.S. troops deployed to Syria. In light of the situation in Syria and the significant interest, we recently learned that those numbers were higher. And so asked to look into it, I learned today that, in fact, there are approximately 2,000 U.S. troops in Syria. As I understand it, as it was explained to me, these additional forces are considered temporary rotational forces that deploy to meet shifting mission requirements, whereas the core 900 deployers are on longer-term deployments. And as you know, for many of our deployments, numbers will fluctuate from time to time, but given that this number is significantly higher than what we've been briefing.
Okay, that should have been a bombshell when it came out. It didn't even cause a ripple. Nobody asked the question, why did you double the numbers? What are those additional troops doing? No answer at all. It's just, it's the enduring defeat of ISIS mission. Okay, but why double it? I mean, double. That's not just like a couple of rotational forces. That's literally sending twice as many as you had in there. For what reason? I can attest the military does not deploy anyone anywhere unless they have authorization from the White House. And then that gets passed on down to the Pentagon, and then, of course, on down to the forces in the field. And none of the White House doesn't approve that unless the Pentagon had some reason for it, unless they said, hey, we request more. I used to do that job. I worked in the Pentagon for a long time in the early 2000s and specifically worked on the deployment orders that went out to the field. So I know exactly how that process works. And so the question is, who originated the request? Why did they give them? And what are they doing now? No one answered the question. The reporters in that pool and in the press conference there, they asked a couple of questions at the time and then started yawning, I guess, and moved on to whatever was next. No one asking this since. I looked, I did a search to see if I could find out anything that has been reported. What happened next? No one even asked what the troops were doing. So there seems to be a tremendous lack of interest in this sort of thing, except among the people who love it. And so now then, here we come in with President Trump is about to come in. And so now there's some concern by them, by these so-called political elite and these warmongers who love conflict, want to deploy as many troops as they can elsewhere, want to keep every deployment we have, warn that the sky is going to fall if any troops are withdrawn anywhere. And by the way, let me just, it's kind of a side note, but a really important one here. Those now 2,000 troops in Syria have no meaningful combat power. I've heard many people say over the years that, well, they're there in case we get into something with Iran, and we need to be defended from that. Yeah, I mean the ISIS stuff, sure, but really it's about Iran, so we can do it. Folks, if you've ever seen the map of Syria, it's huge. It's an enormous country, vast tracts of desert, etc. And you're talking about what was 900? That's roughly a battalion plus total. A battalion in a whole huge area of Syria, of northeastern Syria. Most of their time was spent defending themselves. It's force protection. It's a requirement. I was on a very small base in Iraq at one point near the Iranian border, and I can assure you I was part of that group that we were primarily concerned with establishing perimeter security because there were so few of us. So we had to make sure that half of our effort was spent in self-defense and then the other half doing whatever the job was, but that left a very small number of people to do it with. And so if you want to claim that militarily you're there to, quote, the enduring defeat of ISIS, but you don't have a fraction of the combat power. And again, from my personal experience, when we were trying to vanquish the Taliban, and there was from 2005 and then the 2010-11 area when I was back when they had grown from allegedly 1,500, I think, back at the 2005 to somewhere around 10,000 here. And that's the number that's being bandied about that currently if ISIS is holding. You see Gary showing this huge, vast area. There's one battalion. We'll say two. We'll just give it benefit of the doubt and say that's about 2 battalions total manpower, not fighters, but total manpower. And I was in Afghanistan when allegedly around the same number of ISIS fighters and Taliban that existed at the time, and we had 140,000 American and NATO troops to augment the roughly 300,000 Iraqi Afghan security forces that were there at the time. So plus or minus 400,000 or 500,000. And we couldn't do it. We couldn't vanquish them. But now some people are trying to get you to accept that 2,000, not 140,000, not where you're in a country where you're supported by the host government and their entire security apparatus is also working on this, and you have all the big airfields that are constantly supplied and all that stuff. Couldn't vanquish 10,000 then, but 2,000 enduring defeat of ISIS. It's shameful and it's humiliating in how just patently untrue it is. And then we get into the problem that this current administration anyway doesn't have a mission for them, a militarily attainable mission. Yeah, I get it that they make the comment here that that's what they're doing. But we had this. In fact, this is the perfect opportunity to talk about this. So that one was General Ryder about a month ago. Well, yesterday we had Sabrina Singh, the Pentagon spokesman, also talk about this issue, also using the same kind of language about the only mission they're doing there is defeat ISIS. But listen to what else she says.
There are some reports that specific units went into Ain al-Arab or Kobani, which has nothing to do with ISIS. There is no ISIS threat that we know of at that specific area. Can you give us any information on this?
Yeah, I think what you're referring to is some reporting out there that the United States is somehow setting up a permanent structure, a basing facility in Kobani, and that is just not accurate. The SDF has been operating in that region, but I don't have anything to read out on U.S. forces setting anything up permanently in the northern part of Syria. As you know, our footprint within Syria and the de-ISIS mission is in that eastern part of the country.
So pre-inauguration, there is no any change in the posture of the U.S. forces?
Nothing has changed in terms of our posture or our mission when it comes to Syria. The mission continues to be the focus on ensuring the defeat of ISIS. That's why we have our troops there on the ground. That is their sole mission.
That is their sole mission. They keep saying that over and over. And then yet you have some reporting on the ground. Here's in Responsible Statecraft. There's another one in the war zone, which says that, look, that this guy right here, you can see on the screen, there's a video, and it's actually embedded in this the war zone clip, where they have photographs and video of all these trucks coming in with the American flag and all this equipment that they're building. And so you got to ask the question, okay, what about what are these? You said that you have no readout on that. Okay, well, what about these images and these videos and the guy who is on the ground reporting on it on Twitter? And so who are you going to believe here? What all these videos and all these people are showing, or this Pentagon spokeswoman? And you could have picked any one of them. But then that ask you, what are we actually doing there? What is the purpose of it? And listen, I think some of it may be as simple as we just can't say no. We just can't let go. We can't get our claws out of any kind of possibility to deploy military power, the potential for using lethal military force, even though it does nothing for American national security. It takes people who have signed up, like I did at one time, and raised their right hand and said, I will defend the Constitution and defend my country. And then you're sending them over here to throw them out in the middle of the desert indefinitely. To do what? If you go after ISIS people, and I bet they actually do, because they got to get some kind of cover in it. And I've seen periodically reports in the Associated Press and elsewhere that they took out this mid-level ISIS operative, or they got these ISIS people who were getting ready to do something, et cetera, or they tracked them down, whatever. It's periodically every few months, just to kind of to keep the thing going here. But listen, that's the equivalent of trying to drain an Olympic swimming pool with an eyedropper in a rainstorm. It just can't be done. It doesn't matter how many you take out. It doesn't matter if all of those reports were true. It's irrelevant. It doesn't do anything to the overall organization, which, as I just showed you, by contrast, 140,000 and plus 100 or 300,000 domestic security forces couldn't vanquish the Taliban. Definitely not going to happen here. I mean, it's ludicrous to even absurd to continue on going down that path. And yet that's what they have. And so now then here we come. Okay, Trump's coming in now, less than 2 weeks away. And there is apparently some concern that, yikes, but what if he does what he tried to do the first time? What if he wants to come in and get rid of that troops? We cannot have the risk that Trump is going to get rid of those troops there and deprive us of an ability to have a combat operation somewhere. And then what perfect opportunity and timing for these people that on New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, we had that attack in New Orleans, to where there was a former military guy who said that he had been radicalized by the Islamic State, and apparently, allegedly, it had an Islamic State flag on it. What a perfect emotional thing for people to seize hold of. And who better to have that than the chief of all the war lovers, Mike Pompeo?
When America fails to lead, when you don't engage in solid law enforcement and enforcing criminal laws, when you can't secure your borders, when you refuse to call out radical Islamic terrorism and punish it, you get the events of October 7th, you get the events of just this past week in New Orleans, you get a resurgence of ISIS, you get al-Qaeda back growing again after what happened in Afghanistan. This is a set of failed policies that lead directly to increased risks all across America, in our cities and all across this country. I fear not only are there folks who are members of ISIS or inspired by ISIS, as we saw, but there are planners, there are plans, there are people who might well be activated. This is the task that President Trump and his team will face. They need to go find them all, take down these networks, do the solid intelligence collection, right? This is hard work, collecting chatter from abroad and things that are taking place inside the country. It is granular grunt work that's got to be done and executed by the federal officials, by local and state sheriffs and police forces, but it needs to be led by the United States of America from the top.
So you see there, he used every dog whistle you can imagine, every emotional situation you can imagine to just generate and just force feed fear into everybody listening to him. So as a reminder, I just told you, those troops that are in ISIS in Syria right now are a tiny little fraction that do nothing for the whole country. So militarily speaking, They can defend themselves, and then they can periodically take out a guy or so. They do zero, nada, to the institution of so-called of ISIS group. That's the first thing. Before we talk about anything else, you need to understand that the military force there cannot, has not, and will never defeat ISIS. It can't be done by that small number of force. It couldn't have been done by 140,000. But now that you see, I mean, this guy was just like chomping at the bit to be so thrilled to tie together something that happened in New Orleans on New Year's Day so that he could fuel, we got to stay here. And he, you see him going straight to the Trump administration. His team is going to have to tackle this hard problem. And then he starts attacking it to al-Qaeda, going back to 9/11 fears. It's connected to 10/7 in Israel. It's because of that too. And all the cities all across America, literally, he says everybody, as though the whole nation is about to fall to these, these marauders, even though there's no physical evidence of any of that. And then he says that Trump's team's going to have to go and find them all. And we have to do all this, granular intelligence work. And then we got to go get them, etc. Obviously, he wants to continue on with the troops in the Middle East, making no connection in any of his comments, explaining and not even attempting to explain how a handful of troops in that big map that Gary showed you a second ago in Syria is going to do anything to stop what happened here. He was also threw in the border issue. Yeah, it's a border crisis. Okay, the guy didn't cross the border. He's an American citizen. He lived there. He's a former military service member. I think it was like 8 or 10 years after he had left service before this happened. So the border issue has nothing to do with what happened in New Orleans at all. Zero. There was an issue of the guy apparently being radicalized. At least as of so far, I've not seen anything that's explained the story of how that happened. So that's a big open question mark that I'm definitely interested in finding out. But it's a one-off so far. And the FBI has said he didn't seem to have any other accomplices. So as far as we know, it was one person who lost his mind, got radicalized, and took some irrational action here. Not unlike many of these other crazy people we see around the United States that to do other kinds of horrific violence to people that they lose their minds for different reasons, whatever. But it's, unless there's something I missed, this is the only one I've seen for, gosh, many, many, many years, if not the only one I've ever. So then to take what that one event was and then to make a connection to all of these other things, basically 9/11, al-Qaeda, 10/7, the Israelis, the border cross, all this stuff, all of the cities across America, etc. That is just fear mongering at its worst. And then he doesn't even have the decency to say, so we got to keep these troops in Syria because if we don't, then we're going to have some problems. And actually, he didn't. Okay, he's just trying to build a frame so that no one can, if anyone talks about, has the audacity to suggest that Trump should remove those troops, then they'll run back to that, and then they'll build, they'll fan those flames back up again, so that the fear will keep people from doing anything to change that. But Austin, in that original piece I put here from his interview that was yesterday that ran today, he did say that if Syria is left unprotected, ISIS will come back. So he is at least talking about those troops there. But that's irrational too, because those troops will not stop ISIS from coming back. And he says because Assad fell. That's the reason. It's because Assad fell. No, it's not. Are you suggesting that ISIS had been contained by our handful of troops and the Assad regime? The forces that literally collapsed and fell apart at the first pressure from the rebooted al-Nusra group here, that they were preventing ISIS. But now then, since they're not there, holy cow, we have to go in here. Well, listen, if these rebooted al-Nusra peoples, the new leader of it's basically an ISIS offshoot, it's now running in the show in Damascus, they're pretty effective. So you might want to say, hey, maybe they can handle it. And that's exactly what should happen here. Baghdad and Iraq should have handled ISIS in 2014, but we went in and tried to do it for them for some reason. We made their job easier. We spent our troops, so our lives and our wounded soldiers and probably hundreds of billions of dollars just on that one mission alone on behalf, get this, of Bashar al-Assad. We had helped him up until the time he fell from power by making it easier for him to not have to deal with that problem. Why do I want to make it easier on the new guy? Look, we have a really good, let me answer this question too, because people are worried about this. Oh, but if you do, then the terrorist threat to the U.S. will go up. No, it won't, because that's not how we keep ourselves safe. Apparently there's already rumors of people saying, hey, maybe we should go back into Afghanistan because, golly, all kinds of new threats could come from there. Understand this. There's this big old ball. It's called the world. And there are potential military threats and terrorist threats all over that globe. There are, I forget the exact number right off the top of my head, 70 some odd, maybe even more designated terrorist groups that the State Department has on its list that we have to defend ourselves. Things, groups that are specifically antagonistic to the United States. How many of those 70 do you think that we have troops in the country where they allegedly are? 3 or 4. So what about the other 67, 65 some odd groups that we say are terrorist organizations that pose a threat to the United States and we don't have troops on the ground? How many attacks have we had? None that I'm aware of. There's been only a couple since 9/11 that I think of. Boston was one, and have there even been any more? So in the reforms that were made after 9/11, we have developed a substantial capacity with the FBI, the CIA, local law enforcement agencies, friendly intelligence agencies, to have an extraordinarily effective network that searches for, and seeks out threats that may emerge all over the world, even where we don't have troops, especially where we don't have troops, because we don't need them there. Those troops in Afghanistan never helped us out. And if anyone was going to tell you otherwise, I'll call them a bull-faced liar to their face, because I was on the ground. And if you had General Milley, for example, who did make the case that 2,500 American soldiers in the entire country of Afghanistan somehow would keep us safe here, was a liar. He can't be that stupid. And anyone who makes that case is. And I'll just bald-faced tell you that. It's demonstrable. It's self-evident. If 150,000 didn't do it in Afghanistan, then how is 2,500 going to do it? I mean, it's irrational to think that. And yet, with a straight face, they tell you that, as long as you keep the support going for their war. That's what this is all about. And I'm stripping away all the nonsense that they tell you all the time. And just because you see a bunch of stars on their shoulder board and they have credibility because they have these big positions or they're on TV all the time, pierce through that and listen to what they say and compare that with the truth and the reality on the ground. All these things I've told you are evident out there, but they don't tell you any of those things because they just have this lust for conflict, and they definitely have a lust to keep American troops deployed overseas, even when it doesn't help us, even when it harms our own troops and puts them in unnecessary harm's way and causes wounds, and occasionally people would get killed in action over these things, like happened last year. I don't want to see that happen anymore. And actually, before we leave, there's one more thing I wanted to put here, because it was just so recent here. We had Patrick Henningsen on the show just a couple of days ago, and he was addressing this issue here. And I want you to see the way that he describes this, because it's very colorful and I think very accurate.
The opportunism from the political class, from the foreign policy punditry. Oh, this is a perfect example of the threat that ISIS poses to the United States. What do we need to do to counter that threat? We need to raise our deployment in northeastern Syria. We need to build that base in Kobani right now, right on the Turkish border. We need to fight ISIS, because ISIS has reemerged in Syria and Iraq, as if by magic, as if it had nothing to do with the fact that the Kurds open the prisons, as Damascus fell, to create that exact situation of chaos that would tick all the boxes for Trump to go to the country and say, and one more of these crazy, let's be honest, quite unlikely, strange attacks that aren't even attacks. It's hard to know what they are, but one more of these in the pipeline, or a couple more of these, Trump's going to make the case to the nation that we need to fight ISIS again. And that's your war on terror 2.0.
Well, I really hope that the last part of what he said there doesn't come to pass. But I know it's clear, it's evident that there are many in Washington and many in other Western capitals that very much do want a war on terror 2.0, because it keeps the money flowing. It keeps the military industrial complex in those areas cranking. And that makes a lot of people for a lot of money for a lot of people. We just have to be honest with that. It's almost impolitic and impolite to say that, because it's so far askance from what a normal person is that they would literally support a conflict so that they could get paid. But folks, we have to be honest and just look at the evidence. It definitely happens, because a lot of the people who are these big spokesmen for all these things and keep telling you over and over how, my God, that they're coming after us, etc., they benefit from this militarily, financially. It's just how it is. But we're not going to let them get by with it without saying something. So you don't see any of those questions being asked of the mainstream media. Unfortunately, they hardly ever get the hard second and third order follow-up questions. They don't bring up stuff like what we're doing here, but we're going to do it for you because we are unintimidated and uncompromised to tell you the truth. No matter how unpleasant it may be, you deserve to know. Thank you very much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Daniel Davis Deep Dive.